Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today we want to talk about a brand new, incredibly small mini flash NAS that I would argue borrows a lot of architecture from mini PCs. Hang on, is that the mini PC or is that the NAS? That's kind of the problem really, isn't it? Because right now we're seeing more and more companies either established or in the background that have a heritage in the world of mini PCs and I would argue knockoff Intel NUCs, and taking a lot of that design philosophy, a lot of that architecture and moving it towards NAS systems. And as we talked about on this channel more and more in the last 2 years or so, in fact, there is this growing middle ground that's, expanding all the time between turnkey NAS solutions from brands providing you with hardware and software combined, good to go under a single banner, and on the other side you've got your full DIY, get your screwdriver and build from the ground up. In this middle ground that is pre-built, OS ready NAS systems that don't arrive with any kind of software on board, so you get to choose the software you want to use but not have to do any of the building, is getting more and more popular. And as it goes on, more and more brands jump in. Now this is, and I'm going to get the name of the brand right here, the AIFFRO K100. It is a 4-bay M2 NVMe NAS system. This little device here, rocking out the gate with the N100 CPU and 8GB of memory inside, has got 4 M.2 slots inside that allows us to really take advantage of some SSD performance, potentially. Now, why is that? Well, to get a system into a scale of this size, there's going to have to be compromises. And I know we've already done a lot of digging in the background into the architecture, and I'll be straight with you, there have certainly been some compromises. I'll say right now that for this price tag of about 325 quid, there is definitely a user for this device. There's definitely an audience for it. There is definitely someone out there that will see the utilization of this NAS device. The problem is, it ain't me. My problems with this device, unfortunately, are going to be the same as a number of you watching this right now. So why don't we just crack straight on? Let's stay positive, actually. I feel like this intro has been very, very negative. So let's talk about some positives. Number one, this thing weighs nothing. It must only weigh around about 4, maybe 450 grams at a pinch. Knocking out the gate 11.7 centimetres by 11.2 centimetres by just 3.4 centimetres. This thing is tiny. The M2 NVMe's are located on the base of the system with a metal panel. We'll talk about that more as well. And there's also a fan on the other side, a small laptop fan, keeping the whole thing cool with active cooling running all the way through it, and a combination metal and plastic enclosure. Again, I will say metal and plastic because there's a decent amount of plastic here, feeding into ventilation all the way around this. Now, in terms of software, as mentioned, the K100, because there's absolutely no way I'm going to keep getting that name wrong of the brand, I'll say right now, the software that this is rocking out the gate with, it's OS free, but when I got hold of this, it did arrive with a Windows 11 operating system on it. Now, whether that's because this is a review unit, I'm not sure, but again, it was moody as all hell. It needed activation. It wasn't legit. And again, maybe that's because this is a review unit. Maybe this has been reviewed by someone else. I'm not going to hold AIFFRO to account for that. But I will hold them to account for, it's probably one of the earliest disappointments about this device, and that was the single Ethernet port there. Let's be honest. If you're going to run a NAS, you want one of two things. You want great internal performance and you want great external performance. We've already talked about a number of different flash NAS systems over the last few weeks where we have talked about them really pumping the performance of M2 NVMe's inside and the external connectivity either limiting you to 2.5 GBE, limiting to 5 GBE, 10 GBE, or just going whole hog and giving you loads. This gives you a single 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, so no failover, and also 2.5G, or around 250 to 279 megabytes per second, is not a lot. Indeed, I would say there are modern hard drives like the Seagate Ironwolf 24TB we talked about a while ago. That one hard drive on its own could fully saturate that connection. And this thing has got 4 M2 NVMe slots inside. That is one of those hang-ups from mini PCs I do not want to see here. Now, there are some positives. Number one, we have a plethora of USB here. We've got two USB 10 gig ports there. We've got a couple of USB 2 ports for KVM. We've even got USB power with this device arriving with a 65 watt USB Type-C power connected in. We were able to run this, by the way, off a USB power bank, and it ran like a charm. That single Ethernet port there at 2.5G is just too much of a pain. Add to that the fact that you're going to have to really depend on the OS of choice, whether you're going to be able to take advantage of network adapters on USB. So if you wanted to add further 2.5 gig or even 5 gig connectors, you're going to hit some walls depending on the NAS software you use. The testing that we talk about later on in the video, we went exclusively with Unraid on this to get some benchmarks via terminal. And I'll say right now that the support of 5 gig adapters and 2.5G adapters on that platform at least isn't that bad. But it's not the same on other ones. The other thing I'll highlight, this device doesn't seemingly have any Wi-Fi. There's no Wi-Fi connectivity on it. Now again, not everyone's going to use it. But when we talked about these middle ground OS-free NAS devices in the past, whether it is we'll go to something that's full turnkey like a Ugreen, or scaling it back to some of the CWWK NAS systems and more, all of those devices at least had the good grace to arrive with a Wi-Fi 6 adapter inside and a couple of antennae. No one's going to really use it, but at least gave you a secondary access. This doesn't even have that. That little bit of mini PC architecture is not present here. Which brings me to the second thing that I had mixed feelings about in the case of the K100, and that is the storage itself. Now, when I got a hold of this device, it was the device that if you look online, I believe for an extra 30 or 40 quid, you get one with an SSD inside, ranging from 256 gig up to 2 TB. Again, the price does fluctuate. Now, that drive that arrived inside was some no-name, I think it was a ByWin drive actually, I should say, so that's Acer connected. But I'll say that when we dug in to the hardware architecture and the PCIe lanes, each one of those M2 NVMe's were PCIe 3x4, but they'd all been downgraded to PCIe 3x2. Now, we don't know if that was because of a limited hardware resources. We didn't know if that was just general management component value because of the CPU. We don't know if it was a thermal thing. But those 4 M2 NVMe's limited down to Gen 3x2 was a little bit of a pain in the bum. It's better than ×1, of course, but still a little disappointed given that all of the product pages list those slots as PCIe Gen 3x4, and only in a few of them did I find them downgraded and listed as 3x2. The other thing, a lot of the product pages I saw for this device alongside that N100 CPU, which by the way I really like, the memory listed on all the websites I could find was LPDDR5 8 gig. This has got 8 gig and it is LP memory. But when I went into the memory protocol using Unraid's terminal, this was listed as DDR4. Now, hopefully that's an error. Hopefully that is something that to do with this review unit. Maybe it's pre-development, I'm not sure. But that was really disappointing, that Micron LP DDR4, when DDR5 is splattered around all over the place. It didn't necessarily impact any of the testing that I was going to do, because I don't think I could have really made the most of it. But still, nonetheless, it was worth highlighting that point. Now, the design internally, they've managed to cram a lot inside here. As mentioned, that base panel, when you remove it, underneath there is a metal plate. That metal plate acting as dissipation for the attached 4 heat pads. Those heat pads directly on top of each of the individual M.2 slots. There's a lot to dissipate that heat. And of course, the CPU found with copper piping, by the way, either side on the installation over the M100, wasn't that shabby either. But I will say again, this system got quite warm. It got quite warm quite quick. When we had the system running, for example, if we go straight into power utilization, that N100 CPU quad core, that's 4 efficient cores, 4 thread CPU there, goes up to a maximum 3.4 gigahertz, but it can actually, its base level performance, I believe, is either 800 megahertz or even 1 gigahertz there. It only scales up when it needs to. Consequently, the TDP on that CPU is rated at 6 watt. Now, in idle we had the system giving us vaguely between 10 to maybe 10.3, 10.4 watts during idle standby utilization, and during active use, the system went up to about 6.1 to about 6.2, maybe even 6.3 watts during active utilization and access to each of those drives, and the CPU sat at around 30 to 40% active activity that whole time. So not terrible numbers, and certainly for this system scale to have a 4-bay NVMe system, pretty darn good, but it's definitely not the best in the market right now. In terms of noise, when we had the system during that full operation, in active it went up to, because the fan really kicked in, it went up to about 36 to 38 dBA, and during idle times it actually went down quite nicely, down to about 26 to maybe 28, 29 dBA on average there. So it certainly wasn't silent, and I'll say during boot, that fan for about 15 seconds does go to peak noise, but still nonetheless average. And that's kind of the word I'm going to keep coming back to for this device, just the word average. It's not bad, but it's not out of this world. It's just very average. And then when you look at the speed of the individual M2 NVMEs, we tucked in again with Unraid going into terminal, then doing some general testing there. We saw with 1 GB test files that the read speed, again, the read and write were pretty similar, around 580 to about 610, 620 megabytes per second for each of those slots. But that still kind of showed some real internal bottlenecking taking place. And when we did a copy procedure between the first and second slots, we only saw performance numbers of approximately 280 to about 310 megabytes per second. So again, pretty blah numbers there throughout the whole thing. And that's kind of the big takeaway for this, because it's not a bad NAS, it's just insanely average. Where we do like it, I like its scale, I like its incredibly small footprint, and I like the fact that this isn't going to make a big dent on the electricity bill. I also think as a mini PC come NAS, it's not the worst out there. But unfortunately, too much of this device feels like a mini PC than it does a NAS. That single port there on the rear, 2.5 GBE with very little means to upgrade it, not great. That 8 gig of memory, being a little unclear about the architecture, and the fact you can't even upgrade it beyond 8 gig, despite the N100 supporting substantially more memory, is disappointing. And the PCIe slots there and the overall performance I found internally just felt lackluster. Overall, I'd say right now the AIFFRO 4-bay SSD NAS is just very blah. I hope to see them do more with this, but they've got to move away from the aesthetic of a mini PC because it's trapping them in. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. There's a written review below with further information on our tests, power consumption, and the noise levels of this device, along with a lot more of the close-up images of this device. So do check that out. But apart from this, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you had a fantastic weekend, and I'll see you next time.